So I want to talk tonight about our affective responses to experience. Okay, so as life flows along, from morning to evening, from day to day, we're impacted, right? We feel things, and other people do too. I hope I'm not saying anything radically new with a statement like that. But I also want to suggest that we carry at least some identification, and maybe a lot, with our particular emotions. And we can see this in the way that we say things like, the sunrise makes me happy, or I always cry during romantic movies. We subconsciously think that part of who we are is our emotional landscape, which is relatively constant, relatively fixed, right? This is how I am. So let's explore a little bit in this realm and see how it relates to Dharma practice and to what Buddhism says about training our minds. So I hope we'll start off in territory that's pretty familiar, and you might be saying, yeah, okay, I get it. And then let's wander forward with that and see what some of the implications are and how that emerges in our practice. So first of all, let's consider how uniform are people's responses to a given event. I'm remembering back to the time long ago when I was working, and the company I was working for, the founder of that company was getting ready to retire. And he sent out, an email to all of his colleagues and business associates just to let them know that, at a certain time in the future, 5 or 6 months from now, he would be retiring. So he just wanted to let them know and say something about how nice it was to work with them, etc. And he got back a lot of responses, from the people who knew him well. And he noticed that his American friends tended to write back and say, congratulations, fantastic, what are you going to be doing next? Something like that. And this was an international company. And almost all the responses he got from his Japanese colleagues said, I'm so sorry. Because at least at that time, a while ago, the understanding was that, if you were retiring, you would lose your connections, many of your meaningful life connections to the working world. And so they said, well, I'm sorry you need to be doing that. I hope it's going to be okay for you. So clearly, in some cases, there can be quite a wide variation by culture. And we can imagine many other circumstances that would affect someone's response, of course. So the event itself does not determine how we feel about it. And that's even true in more extreme cases, as we'll see later. But what about the person? Does a given person tend to respond in a predictable way to certain kinds of experience? Well, people do have what's called temperaments. This is even recognized in the Buddhist commentaries. It talks about different temperaments that people have. And we say the same kind of thing. We don't always use that word, but we know that certain people are generally warm or anxious or hot-tempered or hesitant. And this is real. We do see some stability. In fact, that stability is exactly why we can identify with our emotional habits. That relative stability allows us to think, I am like this, or that person is like that. But for the Buddha, these habits are all just that. They're conditioned habits. Some of them are very deeply conditioned and may not change in the course of our life, and some of them are less so. And it's expected, though, that Dharma training will shift our emotional responses over time. right? It has to, because we're moving in the direction of less suffering, right? So that means that as we practice, we will less often experience a reaction that comes from greed or hatred or delusion. So this all might sound pretty clear. Yeah, I get that theoretically, but what does that imply? Well, it means that we're going to have to give up our subconscious idea that we are always angry or anxious or envious in certain situations. And sometimes that is a real barrier on our path, is getting past our own expectations of how we should feel. So to be clear, we do have whatever emotional response that we have. That is a lawful arising. So I am not talking about experience needing to be a certain way or certain responses not being the right response. I just want to say that really clearly, because emotional realm can be an area of a lot of suffering, not just for the emotions themselves, but we have ideas about that. Oh, I have too many emotions. I have too few emotions. I have the wrong emotions. So we add extra judgment onto our emotions. And I'm not making any judgments like that. What arises is what arises. But I am saying that over time we do expect shifts. Ajahn Chah, a Thai teacher from the last century, said that one measure of our practice is that as we move along the path, fewer and fewer things cause us to suffer, and more things bring us happiness. And that's a very broad brush statement, but doesn't that make sense? If we're moving away from suffering, there would generally be that trend. It's kind of an average trend. Don't think it sort of goes linearly, because it doesn't, but it's an average trend. And I think the reason for that is clear. Greed, hatred, and delusion are unwholesome or unskillful. So they're sort of ethically detrimental things, whereas skillful or wholesome qualities like patience or care, compassion, metta, honesty, these things actually bring happiness. Ethical conduct is the root of a deeper kind of happiness, and we uncover more and more of that on our path. So now let's go a little farther along this idea. Sometimes this development of how we respond in an affective way can go in surprising directions. So I want to relate a story that I heard recently from a teacher. This teacher is someone who used to have a lot of anger. So he was an angry person. Earlier in his life, he would have characterized himself that way before he had done much practice. And he's addressed it a lot of different ways, sometimes just with mindfulness, sometimes with actively practicing metta, things like that. But he says that he's practiced for a long time now. He says now he goes walking, and he likes to pick up bottles and trash that he finds along the walkway. And sometimes when he's walking with someone, the other person will express anger that people have been littering. People have not been taking care of the environment. But he says that he feels nothing but happiness, because it's a chance to pick up trash and bottles and make the space look more beautiful than before he got there. And he noted also a little bit to the side that sometimes the person who's expressing anger is not picking up any bottles. They're just expressing the anger about littering. So, do we always need to have the conventional emotional response? No. No. Who's happy about finding bottles along the road? This guy who's practiced for a long time is. Great. We can be genuinely happy about trash sometimes. So this path goes against the stream. That might be a phrase you've heard. And this is actually noted in the suttas. So I'm not just making this up. This is from the Sutta Nipata. What others speak of as happiness, that the noble ones speak of as suffering. What others speak of as suffering, that the noble ones have known as happiness. Don't take it too literally. You could read that and say, come on, what about war or disease? Of course, that's not what it's talking about. We can give Buddhism a little bit more credit than that. So I think it's saying something a little bit more subtle. What others speak of as happiness, that the noble ones, meaning long-time practitioners who have some understanding, that they speak of as suffering. What others speak of as suffering, that the noble ones have known as happiness. I understand this to mean that the more commonly accepted ideas of happiness, such as material possessions or worldly success of some kind, tend to become less appealing to people who have done a lot of Dharma practice. Those people maybe find a different and more satisfying kind of happiness in things like simplicity or living a Dharma-oriented life. So like we mentioned, a few minutes ago, the person who is happy about seeing trash that they get to pick up, make the world more beautiful. There's a way that wholesome qualities provide the foundation for a deeper kind of happiness. Might even be that, what others speak of as suffering, having to wait, having to, be with people who are in distress. Maybe that's a form of happiness if your heart is very compassionate. That's a wonderful opportunity to connect, to serve. This same text that I quoted from a little bit later says that some of the insights that one has along the path of letting go run counter to the entire world. This was not written down, but it was said 2,500 years ago. So the Buddha's world was similar. Even then, people who were doing long-time practice started to feel different in a certain way, started to see things differently, to the point where they felt like maybe they had different values. So we see this. You don't even have to be a long-time practitioner to start running into this. As a teacher, I hear fairly often from people who have started to practice regularly that they aren't as interested in hanging out with some of their friends now that they're meditating. So the activities that they do with those friends just don't seem as interesting or as enjoyable. Now, this is okay. This is normal, natural. I don't tell people to go out and get rid of those friends immediately. I tend to say, just add some Dharma friends. Just add a few extra people. Add some people that also meditate or that will understand something about what you're getting into now, and just let things evolve as they do. So we started out with very obvious statements about our affective response, our emotions, and we kind of followed that into how is this changing along the path? Have we wandered into kind of surprising territory? Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, things do change such that I'm not quite as in alignment with the usual suffering of the world. That's because the usual conventional way in the world is a path with a lot of suffering. And we're trying to do something different here, and yet we still live in the world. How does that work? So one implication of all of this, I would suggest, is that we need to develop a certain kind of confidence. Maybe the confidence to have the actual response that we do and not require it to be what is expected by society, by other people, even by ourselves. Can we acknowledge that our emotional responses are changing? And of course they are. This is the path that transforms us, transforms our way of seeing the world. We have to allow ourselves to change, though, if we're going to walk this path. We have to allow ourselves to change. In Zen, there's a process called Tangaryo. where a practitioner has to wait outside of the monastery gates for anywhere from hours to days before they're being led inside to join the monastery and practice. And it's supposed to demonstrate your dedication, maybe, and also it's a chance to watch your mind when it's under some stress. You pretty much just put in a room and said, you sit here and we'll come get you. You don't know how long that's going to be. I mean, they give you food and they let you go to the bathroom, but other than that, it's pretty much it. And so Gil actually went through this process when he was doing his Zen training. He did a period of Tangaryo. And when it was finally over, after a couple of days, his response was not actually relief or joy, or maybe there were some of those things, but what was most prominent was that he cried because he thought that he would never be that intimate with himself again. That was his response after being locked in a room for a couple of days. I think he was surprised that that was what he felt. That was maybe different than what he would have expected. So can we allow ourselves this kind of freedom of response? I think practice moves us toward a kind of deep inner honesty, where we really open up to how things feel in a complete way in ourselves, rather than in a conventional way or in a habitual way. We accept that part of us might feel happy at a funeral or saddened at a wedding. We allow ourselves the full range of feelings to flow and to change as the path changes us. Now, we wouldn't express or act on just any of our inner experiences. We can still have discernment about what would be appropriate, for the people that we're with, of course. We might not say or do anything with the feelings that we have arising if they're quite unconventional or unexpected from the usual. But part of this training that we're doing is not to suppress our inner response, and instead to be clearly mindful of it. And to have the confidence that if we keep seeing honestly, our inner world will harmonize and will move toward more like that response that Ajahn Chah mentioned. More and more things bring some measure of inner joy to us. Isn't that nice? You could have inner joy and not have to express it if it's not expected in that situation, and yet there you are, not suffering on the inside. So it's a reasonable question to ask, how do we do that? So let's turn now to practice. How can we practice with including more inner emotions and responses? So the first way I'll mention is something that I do in my own practice sometimes, which is to create an atmosphere of safety for various inner responses. Sometimes I'll note to myself at the beginning of a sit, I actually say this in my own mind, it's okay for anything to arise, and it's okay for anything to cease. And sometimes I also add that I won't dismiss any responses that come, I won't laugh at them, and I won't make them into anything that they're not. So you might try it if that sounds appealing. It's interesting, because we can be our own barrier in terms of feeling our inner response. What am I supposed to be feeling now? What am I supposed to be thinking? What's the way that I've always felt about this for the last 25 times I've thought about it? But sometimes we can ask, is there anything else here? Something I haven't acknowledged or admitted? It's useful. So I find that when I do this, like when I say it's okay for anything to arise or cease, something in my heart relaxes. And I'm more likely to be able to sense a wider field of my emotional landscape. Of course, it's also important to have the capacity of mindfulness to be able to handle anything that comes up. So make sure that you're developing that muscle as much as possible. throughout the day, on and off the cushion. And if anything comes up after you've invited, it's okay for anything to arise or cease. If anything comes up that feels like it's getting overwhelming, it's fine to back off. You don't have to stay with anything that's arising. We just want to make sure we're not limiting ourselves. So it's also the case that the Buddha gave some specific recommendations for how to train our perception and how to relate to experiences such that we don't get caught up in just habitual responses. And I'll name just a few of them tonight. Probably the most important is to notice the quality of anicca, of inconstancy or impermanence. That's the Pali word, anicca. And particularly, we can notice that in the realm of feeling tone, whether experience is pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And also mind states, which our emotional responses go into that realm. If we start watching, we see that they change all the time. Pleasant, unpleasant, pleasant, neither, unpleasant, neither, pleasant. If you try to track feeling tone, it's always constantly shifting. And as we respond to that emotionally, we can start to feel that there's a lot going on. And also, maybe more subtly, when we allow ourselves to see change with some continuity for a long time, the heart begins to understand at a deeper level than our thinking mind, starts to understand that clinging doesn't really make sense. Things just keep changing, right? So when we're clinging less, getting stuck less often, then the mind naturally becomes more flexible, more responsive, which we could call freer, right? More flexible, more responsive. So Dharma practice, like the realm of noticing anicca, noticing feeling tone, tracking our emotions, that is a practice. It's a way of corralling the mind to, pay attention in a certain way. But if we pay attention in that certain way, in a wise way, it will eventually open up and become more flexible. Does that make sense? So if we wisely contain the mind in certain ways, we're stopping it from dissipating its own energy and sapping it away through clinging. So then it gets freed up to be more creative, more flexible, more able to respond. So the fruit of practice, where we're open, we allow ourselves to be more and more emotionally responsive, even in surprising ways, is that we become freer, a freer response. These trainings open and release the mind, so it's less stuck in conventional ways of seeing things. It's subtle. We're slowly learning to free the mind from various deadening or limiting responses. We are our greatest limitation, actually. And then another crucial understanding that comes from this is that we begin to let other people have their responses also, whatever they are. There comes to be less judgment, less policing of other people's ways of being, ways of seeing things. This comes about naturally as we learn to loosen our own way of seeing things. And so this is a way to reduce conflict. So much conflict comes because of rigidity in how things are seen. We can help by increasing our own freedom of response. So to be clear, we don't become, more lax in areas like ethical conduct because we learn that, reducing harm leads to deeper happiness. But in all the ways where we're unnecessarily holding on to fixed ways of seeing things, or habits, or old ideas, or conventions, all of those begin to soften. So I think this is the secret of why quite a few long-time meditation practitioners, particularly monastics, you can see this, but many long-time practitioners seem to get jollier and more peaceful, right, as they practice, and also more surprising in their responses. So I want to end by reading a story from The Monastery Within. This is Gil's book from a little while ago. And try to listen to it in light of what we've talked about tonight. It's a few pages. I hope you'll indulge me it's 4 pages. I hope you'll indulge me in reading the whole thing because it takes us kind of on a journey of a change in emotional response, an opening up, a freeing, and then a maybe surprising by the end. So read it, listen to it in light of what we've talked about tonight, of allowing our emotional landscape to change. So the abbess of the monastery was a most exceptional person. She seemed to always have a smile in her eyes. When she looked at you, it seemed as if she knew you better than you knew yourself. She once told the following story of how she first came to the monastery. When I was 13, my family would send me up to the mountains around the monastery to collect edible plants for our evening meal. These foraging trips were the only work I enjoyed doing. Otherwise, I tried every trick I could to avoid work on my family's farm. I was still in school, but school had no interest for me. My anger was a welcome barrier to learning anything the teacher was teaching. On one of my foraging trips, I would pass by the monastery while the monks and nuns were out sweeping the leaves from the pathways. The first time I saw them working, I was mesmerized watching them go about their work. For many months after, I would often stop a while to watch them sweep. They worked silently and with an efficiency that seemed effortless. Then, one day, a monk walked up to me and asked what I was doing in the mountains. The question frightened me, and I became defensive. I resented anyone who tried to get to know me. So instead of answering the question, I countered by asking what he was doing. And the monk smiled and answered that he had been told to sweep and that he was just killing time until he could return to his room for a nap. As I walked home later that day, I thought about his answer and was glad that he did not seem any different from me. When I was required to do anything, my heart was never in it, and my attitude was that I was just passing time until I could be excused. Taking a nap was certainly preferable. The next time I passed by the monastery, on one of my foraging trips, a nun stopped her sweeping and also asked what I was doing. Again, I resented the question. It felt like an intrusion. However, this time I did not feel as scared. Again, I deflected the question by asking what she was doing. She answered that she was doing extra work in hope of being assigned to the kitchen, which was warm in the winter and always seemed to have 1 or 2 extra sweet rice cakes in the cupboard to nibble on. Without saying anything, I nodded and left to continue my foraging. The nun's answer resonated with me, since I too liked to be warm, and eating sweet cakes was one of my favorite activities, second only to sleeping. The next time I passed the monastery, another monk asked me the same question. This time I was surprised. I was not defensive or resentful of being asked. However, again I deflected the question back to him. He explained that he was sweeping as a spiritual discipline to help him overcome his anger. Later, as I walked the mountain trail with my bag of plants, I felt a kinship with this monk. Like me, he had anger. But I was perplexed that he would want to overcome it. For me, my anger protected me. A week later, I was again outside the monastery watching the monastics sweep. Yet another monk came up to me. When he asked what I was doing, I mumbled something about collecting plants. I doubt he could hear me. My voice was so faint. But I did muster up enough strength to ask him what he was doing. He replied that he was beautifying the monastery so that others could be inspired in their work of spiritual transformation. Before I left him, I glanced down the well-swept paths and realized that part of the reason I was compelled to watch the monks sweep was that they seemed to be transforming the paths into something that made me feel peaceful. The next time I stood outside the monastery watching the monastics, I was drawn to walk over to yet another nun, and before she could ask me what I was doing, I asked her. She looked at me with kind eyes, and after what seemed like a long but soft silence, she explained that she was sweeping to be of service to all who used the monastery, and in practicing this way she hoped to find ultimate peace. As I left the monastery that day, I thought her answer strange, as I didn't know what she meant by service and by peace. I certainly couldn't see how these had much value for me. The next time I visited the monastery was the last time. I had an unfamiliar feeling as I walked up into the mountains. It was a warm glow of gladness in anticipation of what I would find. When I arrived at the monastery, I walked up to an old monk who seemed to be absorbed in his sweeping. I inquired what he was doing. As he answered, each of his words washed over me like cleansing water. Me? I am not doing anything. My self-consciousness was swept away long ago. There is no I that does anything. Before I could respond, he handed me the broom and walked away. I have been here ever since. So, why are you sweeping your path? So with that, we'll shift to, if you have any questions. And we have a microphone so that others can hear and we can record it. Yeah, Jim behind you.
Thank you for your talk. It seemed very instructive. I'm wondering if I understood it correctly, or you seem to be pointing at if we sort of impose some constraints on our thinking, and specifically probably trying to diminish hatred, greed, and delusion, or we obtain freedom, or it leads us to freedom through these constraints, in a sense. Is that
Yeah, you look puzzled as you say that. Is that the part that you're trying to clarify?
Well, it seems pleasantly surprising, but also it sort of makes sense. But I'm just wondering if that's a reasonable summary.
Well, I don't know if it's a summary of the whole thing, but it's certainly a thread that was in there, is that channeling our attention in certain specific ways, it feels like it might be a constraint, but if we do it in the particular way that's prescribed through these practices, it has the effect of opening the mind, making it more flexible and free. And yeah, I think that's can be somewhat intuitive, and yet, we do wonder about it. But it's clear enough, right, that if we, at least everybody who's made it to this room, I think, is that if we keep living life as just kind of following the whims of our mind, we begin to get a feeling like it may not be going anywhere in particular, or at least not where we were hoping it would. And so the question is, if we can put in some kind of, is there a way that we can tweak it, that's a technical term, such that we actually reduce the constraints in the long run. So that was what I got to at the end, is how we practice. And that's what's represented by the monastery and, taking on the path of sweeping the path. So we're doing less, we're channeling our attention in certain ways, noticing body, feeling, mind and mind states, right? The 4 foundations of mindfulness. But as we do that, there's a way in which we discover all the ways in which we're limiting our own mind through just habit, conventional responses. We understand how things work. We understand how we're bringing about a lot of the suffering that we experience in our mind. And as we let go of the ways in which we're limiting ourselves, we become both happier and more flexible. So I'm hoping that, by saying that in sort of a broad way, we can think of maybe examples in our own life where that's been the case, where actually doing the practice has brought about some kind of shift such that we felt looser, more open. And I wonder, has there been anything like that in your practice?
It's a work in progress.
It's always a work in progress, for sure. But even something as simple as in the physical realm, often people find when they start practicing that they relax. Something in the body actually feels a little bit more relaxed. Why? How can that be? Just from sitting still. But if we were sitting watching TV, this wouldn't happen. But if we sit and pay attention to the breath over time, maybe we soften a bit. That's a certain kind of release, a certain kind of opening. So even that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, over here.
Thank you for your talk. Two things that came to my mind is being non-judgmental
Yeah.
and unconditional positive regard. Trying to have that kind of running in the background. I'm a teacher, so and I believe I work in a system that is fraught with inefficiency, should I say?
What kind of a teacher are you?
Special education.
Special education,
And
okay.
today I was judgmental 2 times, and I acted unskillfully both times. And your talk helped me kind of reflect on that, and how, I try to use my practice as, as a life tool, a relationship tool,
Yeah,
as much as an inner journey.
definitely, yeah.
So thank you for reminding me to attempt to stay non-judgmental and retain positive, unconditional positive regard. Is there a term in Buddhism, or is there a concept that would match that unconditional positive regard?
I suppose that's an aspect of metta,
Okay.
of generally having a mind of goodwill toward whoever we're interacting with.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. I think we don't need to constrain ourselves to, unconditional positive regard. Yeah, let's just call it part of metta.
Okay.
That's good enough. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, here's one.
Thank you so much for the talk and the closing story. So I was sort of struck by how, as the monks and nuns progressed, right, it started from a very, I'm sweeping to kill time before I go to sleep, right, a very,
Yeah. Self-oriented.
self-oriented,
Yeah,
right. Then I want to be warm. Then I want to help others, on the path and make it more beautiful for others, and it becomes outward looking. And, just struck by how you, at least me, right, you don't come into this saying, I want to be of service to others, right? You're like, no, I need to find some way to calm my mind because I'm suffering, and, I just need to be able to, deal with myself, right? But then once that calms, you can begin to think about others. And, to your point, I was a professor, I've been an investor, I've run companies, and like every time it starts, it's about me, it's about me, it's about me. But at its best, it's about service to others and helping others. And that's the only thing that ultimately, when you talk to people who've been successful or have reached, some peace in what they do, it's always outwardly looking. Nobody says, yeah, I know at the end it was all about me, right? That never ends up being the end of the story. So anyway, I found that really an interesting aspect of how the whole thing unfolded.
Yeah, certainly there's a shift to including a bigger perspective. What did you make of the last fellow who says, you know, there's no one who does any sweeping anyway?
Transcendental, right?
Yeah. So this particular path, I think, goes all the way.
All the way back, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. If anyone has typed anything into the chat, we could have one from online. You're invited online if you want to type anything in. Someone is watching. It's just nice to include everyone. It can be helpful at times on our path to just reflect internally. Why is it that I'm practicing or still practicing? I don't recommend doing this like every sit or even, every week. That'd be too much. But like maybe every year, something like that. And the reason for that is that it refines over time. Remember the story that I read? And so we have to kind of renew that in a sense, and maybe we'll discover that something new has emerged. We have to keep, tracking this and kind of, when the space opens in your practice, if there's been some kind of a release, there's a way in which we have to step into that space and occupy it in order to then take the next step. So I just offer that as a piece of advice. If you haven't for a while reflected on what you're doing, sit down and have a session where you just allow things to come up about why you're practicing and see if anything's different. And if it isn't, that's okay too. And if it is, move into the space. All right, that'll be it for tonight. Have a wonderful rest of the day.